Ja nigdy nie zobaczyłem, że ona ma stopy. Przepraszam, nie jestem stópkarzem, nie patrzę na stopy każdej postaci, jaka istnieje. Wychodzimy poza mapę Dark Souls 2. Widzieliśmy takich filmów już z Elden Ringa i chyba z Dark Souls 1 i coś tam. Boundary Break, czyli wychodzenie poza mapę. Co deweloperzy w jakiś sposób, z jakiegoś powodu ukryli za mapą Dark Souls 2. Let's go.
Hey, what's going on? Welcome to another episode of an ongoing series where we basically take the camera anywhere we want to try to find secrets and new discoveries to some of our favorite games. And now we finally end the Dark Souls trilogy with Dark Souls 2. It's taken a little while to cover this one because the earliest camera that was made was patched out with later revisions of the game, and so I've had to downpatch the original game in order to find one working camera. I want to thank Turtlebox and UKRYWA for helping me out with this episode because we got some really cool things that I wouldn't have found by myself because there's just so much game. Anyways, why don't we start off by talking about some of those things. I think the best way to start this video is with Shaun-a-Lot because a lesser known fact about the character, although you see her all the time in Dark Souls 2 naturally, she's hiding a feature to her face that is really interesting because
Ma jedno oko innego koloru, co ty gadasz?
for some reason underneath her peekaboo, she has a multicolored eye that is completely
To się nazywa heterochromia, nie? Jak jest jedno oko... Znaczy jest heterochromia iridium i chyba heterochromia iridis. Jedno z nich to jest, że masz obie tęczówki innego koloru, a druga nazwa to jest, że masz jedną tęczówkę z jakimś dodatkowym kolorem, nie? Ale to nie wiedziałem. Plus ona zawsze ma jeszcze, prawie zawsze, ten kaptur na głowie to już w ogóle. Ale to...
different from the eye that's always visible in the game. This one has purple as well as a blue in the retina. It's thought that this was meant to be shown to the player at some point because her involvement in the game was supposed to be a lot deeper than it was in the final game. And she's not even the only character that has hidden details. This creature over here that puts you into a covenant has pantaloons under its robes, something that most characters do not have. In fact, it's not just the pantaloons, it has a fully modeled body underneath its robe.
Który to jest NPC? To jest ten po tym? Po koniu, czy który? Nie wiem.
And then there's the character Lucatiel. Now, Lucatiel does have a face that is shown at certain points in the game, but here's two interesting things that I can tell you about this character. When she wears the mask, her face is still modeled underneath. And not only that, by taking the camera all the way up to her face, you can see that she has blue eyes, something that's a little tougher to see with some of these models, unless you were to put binoculars up to these characters' faces, which a lot of us don't think to do. Like Mocklin here. I was so confused by his eyes, and again, I've never taken the time to take the camera right up to it, but it turns out that for whatever reason, Moglin's eyes have black sclera. I don't know if it's meant to be on purpose, or if it was an error that just was never changed. Should also note that he has a fully modeled head with a bit of hair on top.
Czarne białko oczu? Co jest, kurwa?
And then there's this character from No Man's Wharf. His eyes are always closed, but if you were to take the camera inside of his face, you can see that he has fully modeled eyes that happen to be blue. And then there's...
Aha, i dlatego właśnie nam klatki spadają. Fajnie FromSoft, nie? To jest wasza optymalizacja. I tak nie widzimy oczu, a pokazujecie je, renderujecie je. No nieźle.
Falcon over
Żartuję
here.
oczywiście.
Falcon also has something covering up his face, and if you take the camera inside of his headdress, you can see that he has brown eyes, as well as his own set of hair.
Wygląda jak
And then
postać
there's something a lot
gotika.
of people want to know about Chloanne. So naturally, taking the camera inside of her bangs will show you that she has a second pair of bangs, which I assume is supposed to be used to create some sort of depth that one layer would not be able to accomplish. And
Miałem nadzieję, że coś innego pokaże. Jak tak, nie wiadomo, jak się pokazuje Chloanne, na co się patrzy, nie? Nie trzeba dużo mówić o tym.
then there's this enemy here. You take the camera inside of his mask, and you can see that he has a fully modeled face with his own set of eyeballs.
Okej,
A
to jest
detail that you
creepy.
don't find with most characters in Dark Souls 2. In fact, Dark Souls 2 is a considerably tighter ship than Dark Souls 1 by comparison. So seeing things like this boss here that has arms inside of its face, it's sort of a rarity to see how the arms are stored when they're not in use, as any similar characters tend to have things that just get culled out. The best example of which would be the Mimic. Anyone who just watched the last Dark Souls episode I put out would show you that in the original Dark Souls, there is some crazy stuff going on in order for the Mimics to be pulled off in that game.
Widzieliśmy
However, in
to.
Dark Souls 2, the limbs of the Mimic are completely culled out. And so taking the camera inside of its chest will show you that there is nothing to see. Only what the game wants you to see, which is the teeth, as well as maybe, just maybe, the pink portion of the mouth inside.
W ogóle mimiki w DS2, w ogóle czemu to jest 360p? To jest moje pytanie. Mimiki w DS2 dziwne, są inne. Jeszcze oglądane tak. Dość długo gadaliśmy o poprzednim temacie. Dziwne są te mimiki, bo w DS2 nie poznasz ich po łańcuchu, nie? I wczoraj graliśmy w to OG DS2. Mega mnie zdziwił ten mimik, którego spotkałem. Gdzie to było? Tam na dole. Co mnie zeżar? Tam przy tym słoniu, tam gdzie są te pieski śmierdzące, które nabijają skamienienie i tak dalej, nie?
And then this is absolutely crazy. Here in Majula, you can find the Lord Vessel, the very same Lord Vessel that was used in Dark Souls 1. You gotta go inside the mansion, all the way into the back where the cave was that featured that one skeleton. And taking the camera out of bounds and above this area will show you a fully intact Lord Vessel. Although it wasn't really talked about in my Dark Souls 3 episode, this proves that the Lord Vessel is in all 3 Dark Souls games.
W DS3 było w jednym miejscu na samym początku gry, nie? Prawie, że na samym początku. Na początku ściany Lotrik. Ciekawe. Wati, wytłumacz dokładnie, skąd to się tu wzięło. Tam to robiło chyba jako podstawa, czy to było w tym? W Firelinku może? Jako podstawa chyba ogniska to robiło w DS3 w Firelinku. To chyba było to. A tutaj? Czemu to jest poza mapą i sobie tu po prostu wisi? Czy to może jest po prostu taki... Właśnie coś, żeby gracze znaleźli po wielu latach i się zastanawiali, czemu tu jest kurwa naczynie władców, Lord Vessel. Ściany gdzieś tam wklejone, poza mapą.
And then for some more unused content, we can see a lower poly version of this PvP arena, and because this is completely out of sight, we can see a beta element that wasn't used in the final version of the game. See, in the normal PvP arena for this area, there's this wooden tower that you can walk up, but clearly at one point it was supposed to be a gallows. And since the player couldn't see it anyway, the gallows was left behind. And now let's talk about Nasandra. I always thought that Nasandra's lower portion was just supposed to be like one giant entity, but it turns out that if you take the camera underneath,
ona ma
it's
stopy.
supposed to be a dress made of bones. As in...
Ja nigdy nie zobaczyłem, że ona ma stopy. Przepraszam, nie jestem stópkarzem, nie patrzę na stopy każdej postaci, jaka istnieje, ale to gra From Softu, tu muszą być stopy. Czy obrzydliwe, czy nie, widziałem, że są ludzie, którzy nawet stopy Morgota lubią, więc ja w to nie wchodzę, bawcie się dobrze, ale nie musiałem tego wiedzieć.
Indicated by the fact that her bony legs are also stored underneath. And then here's an insane discovery. I believe this episode of Boundary Break is the first one to break this news to anybody. But if you were able to hold the camera inside of the throne at the end of the game, you could see that after the door closes, your player character goes into a completely different pose than what it was before the doors closed. Instead, your character just sits there looking really disappointed for some reason. I wasn't able to get a great shot of this because I was not...
Nie widać, bo napisy zasłaniają takim facepalmem. Kurwa mać, no zostałem tym lordem. Czy warto było, czy nie warto było? 2 pary rąk, co tam stopy.
Really disappointed.
Znalazłem fana rani.
For some reason. I wasn't able to get a great shot of this because I was not able to move the camera during cutscenes, but I was able to pause the camera in place. And this is just where it happened to end up after the in-game camera sort of jumped around. Also, that boss fight before you fight all those rats. There's some unused geometry. Taking the camera over to the left and down below can show you a outlined pathway that was completely unused. In a lot of cases, Dark Souls 2 will have pieces of an area loaded in, whereas most of it is culled out or not loaded in yet. But this particular area is one that is just straight up completely unused. And then for this boss right here, if you were able to break off one of its bodies, it would fall off of it and give you an item. However, if you never break off that body, the item that's supposed to spawn is actually stored just outside the boundaries right here.
Zrozumiałe. To jest normalny zabieg chyba, nie? W wielu grach. Że coś jest poza ścianą, jeśli coś zrobisz podczas walki, to nagle się zrespi w miejscu, gdzie się powinno zrespić na przykład, nie?
Then in Drang Lake Castle, there's these enemies that come out of these mirrors, and I wanted to take a look at the opposite side. Much to my surprise, these are all in fact shields and not mirrors at all, indicated by the handles that the shield bearer would hold on to.
Proszę, wykorzystywanie asetów. To ja robię swoim życiem ekstra. Tak, taką właśnie miało pozycję. Wykorzystywanie asetów, żeby zrobić z nich coś innego. To jest ta kreatywność, której brakuje bardzo często w developmencie dzisiejszych gier, nie? Każdy model musi być unikalny, nie możemy niczego wykorzystać wielokrotnie. A tu proszę, mamy w DS3 właśnie ten Lord Vessel jako podstawa do ogniska, wykorzystane po raz kolejny. Mamy tarczę, która jest wykorzystana po prostu jako lustro. Ja nie wiedziałem, że to tak działa. A to jest ta sama tarcza pewnie, którą ma też Mirror Knight, tak? Z której właśnie wychodzą przeciwnicy, albo bardzo podobna.
And then here, when you go into the memory of Jay, there's all sorts of unused content just out of bounds. One of these barred off areas, if you were to take the camera all the way through, you can see that it's not fully modeled, but there's all sorts of geometry that's left behind that doesn't match up with present day. And it looks like it was just half made or called out, but there's a lot of remnants here to suggest that maybe this area was supposed to be a lot larger. Also, well underneath the bridge, you can see this object here that is used in other parts of the game, but obviously it has no business being here at all. And then we have this boss here that I absolutely adore because when you take the camera underneath the ground, you can see a lot of funny things going on with the character model. The first of which being that before she comes out of the ground, her body is completely straightened out. Not only that though, but she also travels underneath the ground, and she is literally moving underneath the ground where you can see the disturbed parts of the sand that you're meant to see. However, the character model looks absolutely goofy. I love it.
Śmieszne.
And I thought for sure this boss is going to have some really wacky stuff too, considering the fact that he also goes underneath in an opaque surface. But surprisingly, he does not have a set of legs. Instead, there's a particle effect of lava that is constantly moving underneath the stubs of his thighs. And instead of moving
Balrog nie ma nóg. Kurwa, wołajcie Mamona. Znalazłem jego brata. Przepraszam.
to his spots, he gets teleported there instead. Though what's really funny is that when he does teleport, his body sort of twists into the correct position. Even if you haven't played that much Dark Souls 2, there is still something to find for most players that at least got to scratch the surface of it. Here's this table where you meet the first human characters. If you take the camera underneath the table, you can find a bunch of items stored into the same spot.
Książki pod stołem schowane? To przed rodzicami chowane jakieś te świerszczyki? Ja nie wiem. Tam są same baby w tym pokoju, nie? Może one też potrzebują sobie czasem popatrzeć.
And what we got here is
Nie
a
oceniam.
statue, a candle, and 2 books. And then this one's a little bit silly, but right when you first enter Majula, there's these rags caught on a tree. And I saw that at the end of all of this, there's a little box that is the same texture as these tarps. And I was curious as
Nie zauważyłem tego nigdy, że to jest jakiś... To tak serio wygląda? Przypomnijcie mi, żebym to dzisiaj zobaczył, jak włączymy Soulsy. Czemu tu jest kurwa jakaś kostka? Co tu się odwaliło?
to what would be inside of this box, because it looks unnatural in itself. And taking the camera inside will show you that the rags sort of all just bend sharply to a 45-degree angle and are stretched out a little bit. And I can see why that's not that appealing to look at, so that's why they ended up going with the box, which I guess is a better detail than what we have inside here. And now let's talk about spaces that creatures crawl out of. We have this area with the spiders. This might be a little lesser known to people that didn't get that far into Dark Souls 2. But as you can see here, they're pretty much stored inside these spots at all times. And as you get into certain areas, they come out to attack you, which is very cool stuff. But then in a similar situation, when you fight a mountain of rats as a boss, like I mentioned earlier, these guys have these really, really long tubes. So much so that if you were to stare into the tubes, you still wouldn't be able to see them because they kind of bend around a corner. This allows them to spawn indefinitely without breaking the immersion for the player. And because I died here somehow, I'm supposed to be invincible so I can get some footage done very quick. We can even see the rats crawling back into their holes.
Designowo to ładnie wygląda, nie? Widzę jakąś magię w tworzeniu takiego boss fighta, który tak wygląda. Bo to, jak patrzysz na to, jak to wygląda, jest to ciekawe, ale później wchodzisz na tego bossa i masz takie, to jest kurwa boss. I tak mógłbym powiedzieć o co najmniej połowie bossów w Dark Souls 2, więc strzelam, że tu były pewnie ciekawe pomysły, tylko później jak się w to gra, to jest takie przerost formy nad treścią troszeczkę, nie?
We can even see the rats crawling back into their holes. And then in this area, we have these worms here. Similar idea to the past two things we talked about. I just wanted to show you that when they go into their holes, their character models get scrunched up. Not to a hilarious degree, it still looks like a very functioning model. However, this character model is designed to stretch out to show its true lengths to the player. So it's kind of cool to see that in a rare twist, scrunching this character model up looks perfectly organic. And then again, a big thank you to Turtlebox for tipping me off on this one. The Shaded Woods is an area that's completely fogged over, and you're not really supposed to see any details at all. That's the whole point of it. But if you were to remove some of the fog and took the camera over the cliffside to explore a bit, you'd see that there's an unused area that even has its own doorway. Fans have speculated that this was supposed to indicate that there was a shortcut to another area of the game at one point, and the developers axed it, and instead of removing it outright, they used the fog to their advantage and covered it up completely so that you'd never be able to see it. And then I found an area on my own that was pretty similar. It was over here by the Soldier's Rest bonfire, and there's this...
Zawsze mnie zastanawia, jak jest jakaś gra i jest jakieś przejście, które wygląda jakby gdzieś mogło rzeczywiście prowadzić. Jaki był pomysł projektantów na to miejsce konkretne, nie? Tak jak w Demon's Souls na przykład mamy chociażby jeden z tych, jak to się nazywa? Tych drzwi, powiedzmy tam w Nexusie, rozwalone. Czy był kiedyś pomysł, żeby to zrobić inaczej? Czy był jakiś zone, który był testowy, ale koniec końców się nigdzie nie pojawił? To mnie zawsze zastanawia. Plus na pewno po FromSoftie możemy się spodziewać czegoś takiego, że wiele rzeczy, które były stworzone, będą wykorzystywane w następnych grach. Klinice, tak to się nazywało, no właśnie. Że będą wykorzystane w innych kolejnych grach. I czasem to widzimy w Soulsach niektórych, że rzeczywiście niektóre designy wyglądają jakby były z innej gry troszeczkę, nie? I nie mamy potwierdzenia nigdy od FromSoftu, że tak, ten model, ta postać została stworzona do 2 gry temu, ale nie mieliśmy jakoś okazji, żeby ją wykorzystać, więc wykorzystujemy ją teraz, w Elden Ringu na przykład, nie? Ale zawsze, jak jest jakaś fajna gra rzeczywiście, w którą się wkręcam, chciałbym, moim, może nie powiem, że marzeniem, ale moim czymś takim, co bym chciał, żeby było, żeby były jakieś właśnie wywiady z twórcami, które oni tworzą filmy na przykład, że zrobiliśmy coś takiego, ale nigdy wam tego nie daliśmy. Czemu? No bo nie. Ale fajnie, że możecie zobaczyć, że i tak to stworzyliśmy. Jakieś miejsca, tylko to może wtedy być takie coś, że gracze byliby zawiedzeni tym, że taki zajebisty pomysł, czemu go nie wrzuciliście? Pewnie taki byłby odbiór w wielu przypadkach, nie? Że zróbcie to jeszcze raz, bla 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 i takie naleganie, więc może dlatego o tym się nie mówi. Plus, no tak jak mówię, pewnie wiele rzeczy jest przenoszonych do kolejnych gier, żeby można było to, mimo że ktoś na to zmarnował czas, to go i tak nie zmarnował, bo wykorzystamy to zamiast w DS3, na przykład w Elden Ringu. I cyk, i zrobione, nie?
This area that's blocked off by boulders. Well, it turns out that if you take the camera through, yeah, the trail ends pretty quickly, but I feel like the exit hole can be found pretty quickly as well. So sure, the tunnel seems to be missing, but it seems that there's an entry point and an exit point that makes perfect sense. And yet again, I think this was something that was meant to be implemented by the developers and then just stripped out by the final game. And now I want to show you how certain enemies kind of pop out of certain areas. These zombies seem to come out of their own graves.
Plus wiemy też, że wiele gier, jak jest stworzonych, to bardzo często w pewnym momencie jest za duży bloat, za duże napchanie tego produktu, napchanie gry różnymi takimi bardzo pobocznymi rzeczami, które później się wycina, żeby jednak gracza skierować w konkretnym kierunku, nie? I to może być kwestia tego tutaj na przykład konkretnie, nie? Było to wyjście na górę, ale w sumie tam tylko jakiś itemek leżał jeden, niekoniecznie jest to potrzebne, niepotrzebnie wydłuża wędrówkę przez ten świat, wypierdolmy to, udawajmy, że tego nigdy nie było, nie? To jest pewnie też bardzo często używane coś do skracania gier z rzeczy, wycinania z gier rzeczy, które są w ogóle niepotrzebne albo bardzo mało potrzebne.
I want to show you how certain enemies kind of pop out of certain areas. These zombies seem to come out of their own gravestones, and I wanted to show you what that looks like underneath the ground. Surprisingly, they're not just stored down there, they seem to be spawning in. But even still, when they do spawn in, you can see their neutral pose before they start their animation to claw out of the dirt. And then I want to give you a close-up of the first enemy you ever see in the game because they're so tiny and it's so dark outside. But the detail on these guys are really, really interesting. Kind of freaky looking. So much so that I really wanted you guys to take a look at it for yourself. They almost look like the sort of...
Wyglądają jak gremliny. Jak oglądaliście jakiś tam film z gremlinami? Gremliny atakują, czy coś takiego? Jak gremliny wyglądają. Te, co jak polejesz wodą, to się wkurwiają i robią pojebane, nie?
Gargoyles that you would see on old buildings. And Dark Souls 2 has its own birds. Gotta love it. Taking the camera over to these guys will show you that they are just a plain 2D texture with an animation, and they sort of billboard towards the camera, meaning that they have no 3D geometry whatsoever. Whereas typically on this show, there tends to be very low amount of polygons used, but they are usually 3D models. And again, I just want to take another look at another model that's a little bit more difficult to see. One of the first merchants you ever see has a pretty detailed face that, unless you were using binoculars,
To jest Melentia? Ale jest paskudna. Jakbym nie wiedział, że to jest baba, to bym nie powiedział, że to jest baba. Powiedziałem, że to jest jakiś chłop. Pozdrawiam tych, co je zaatakowały przy pierwszym podejściu do gry. Te goblinki, gremlinki, prawda. To jest ból.
you wouldn't get a great look at the model like this. Same thing with the queen. I just want to take the camera up very, very close so that you can get a good look for yourself without the limitations that the game normally imposes on you.
Jej model z bliska wygląda lepiej niż z daleka. Zawsze jak jestem w tym zamku Dranglake i ją widzę z daleka, mam wrażenie, że ona nie pasuje, nie wiem, być może to przez cienie i przez światło, które jest chujowe Dark Souls 2, ale ona zawsze mi jakoś do tego obrazka nie pasuje, jakoś za mocno się wybija na tle tego całego miejsca, które tam jest. Z bliska wygląda okej ten model, ale z daleka wygląda jakby był zrobiony kurwa z plasteliny, jak dla mnie.
Imposes on you. And now I want to talk about zoom outs with environments. Normally I don't do a whole segment dedicated to this, and if you like it, please let me know, and if you don't like it, also it's very important you let me know. That way I don't become oblivious to the silent majority. But I found the environments in Dark Souls 2 to be particularly interesting, and with how detailed they are, it's more fascinating than ever to zoom things out and just kind of show you what's going on with them. Like Harvest Valley here.
Ja chciałbym zobaczyć, wiecie co jeszcze? Mam nadzieję, że to jeszcze pokażę, mamy jeszcze parę minut. Żeby nam pokazał, jak wygląda połączenie między właśnie tym miejscem, tam gdzie zabijamy tą babę, co sobie trzyma w ręce swoją głowę, a wejściem do tego lawowego zamku. Chciałbym zobaczyć, jak to wygląda z zewnątrz.
When you move the camera enough, you can see that it's kind of cased in a box, sort of. Like they store the poisonous fog inside of a box. And no other area in the game does this, so I imagine that's why they had to make a box in the first place. But they also use the outside of the box as environment as well. And as you can see, even though it spans very far, if you take the camera far enough out, you can see it makes a circular pattern. Also, here's the starting area. As dark and moody as it is, if you take the camera all the way out, you can see that's housed inside of a blue void, which makes it really, really easy to see if there's any geometry hanging outside of this model, which of course there isn't. But it's really cool stuff.
Oho, podobno mamy w Elden Ringu, nie? Przypadek? Czy nie?
And I know we already did a zoom out of this area on the intro of the show, but I did want to show you some low poly areas that are off in the distance in this area as well that kind of hint at future areas that you would visit in the game. One detail here shows you the twisting vines and roots of the Forest of Fallen Giants. I don't think that there's any area that you can stand on in Majula that would give you a clear view of this image, making this out of bounds content essentially. And then if you remember those two giant statues just before the giant boss, there's a low poly version of them here as well. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, here's a zoom out of that area as well. I really wanted to show this off because if you're really not thinking about your surroundings, it's really cool to see here.
Ja w ogóle dopiero ostatnio zobaczyłem, że to tutaj to jest wielki miecz wbity w zamek i go trzyma ręka. Przez te wszystkie przejścia i niedoszłe przejścia, gdzie byłem w tym miejscu i wchodziłem zawsze po tą halabardę, chyba to jest tak, czy coś takiego w scholarze, nigdy nie zwróciłem uwagi na to, że wchodzimy po ogromnym kurwa mieczu trzymanym przez wielką rękę. Elden to w końcu DS2.2, prawda. W sumie Invisible Walls of DS2 to 4 tygodnie temu dopiero, ale trwa godzinę 42, o Jezus Maria, to długo.
Cool to see here that platforms and obstacles are all made by environmental context. As you can see, one of the statues is missing his hand, who's supposed to be holding this sword, so instead it's used as a slant for the player to walk up. And then one of the other statues is missing a head, and that head is used as an obstacle before you fight the pursuer. All really cool stuff, but not only that, if you take the camera below the waterline, you can see that these statues are fully modeled, complete with feet. And the sword that's jammed into the side of the building is also fully modeled, and you can see the point of the sword out of bounds.
wiecie co mi się wydaje? Że czasem te modele są w pełni wymodelowane, bo na przykład ktoś ma jakąś wizję artystyczną, tworzy sobie model i mówi, ej, zrobiłem taki model, zrobicie coś z nim? Oni mówią, zrobimy coś z nim, no i przecież nie będą go ciąć i tak dalej. Jak mają gotowy model, powiększą go, oteksturują go, bla 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 i wrzucą tam, gdzie będą chcieli, nie? Pewnie stąd to pochodzi, bo jakbyś wiedział domyślnie, że tak, w tym miejscu będzie stała wielka, nie wiem, jakaś tam właśnie statuetka jakiegoś rycerza i w sumie nie potrzebujesz całego miecza, więc nie modeluj całego miecza, nie potrzebujesz jego stóp, bo będą pod wodą, gracz tego nigdy nie zobaczy, po co to tworzyć, szkoda czasu i tak dalej. Ale tworzenie samego modelu, plus dopiero później zastanawianie się, gdzie by go wkleić, nie? Co z nim możemy zrobić?
And now here's the top of Hyde's Tower. Some people over on Twitter suggested this, but if you ever want to suggest what I look at in the future, I am shifting my focus away from Twitter and onto Discord. You guys can find a link to the Discord channel in the video description, so hope to see you there. And anyways, outside of the tower itself, we can see the pillar that you can go to in Majula as a low poly version of itself, as well as another interpretation of the statues. And then just for fun, I know that there's this Rat King Covenant area that I absolutely adore, by the way. Rat King Covenant for life. Best covenant in the series, in my opinion. And I just wanted to show you what the tunnel leading to
Zajebałem wczoraj szczura. Zabiłem wczoraj szczura kovenantowego.
it, as well as the area itself, looks like from Out of Bounds, because it's so massive in scale. And it looks, frankly, beautiful for an interior area. And I didn't want to rob you guys of this view. And then there's this area with the chariot boss. And I wanted to show you what it looks like when you zoom the whole thing out, that it kind of has like an oval appearance, like the number 0 or something. And not only that, if we take the camera down below and keep the boss alive, you can see he never gets called out at any time. He exists in the game world, even if he's in the complete opposite area of this long hallway. And then I know there's a ton of people that are hung up over the fact that Iron Keep shouldn't exist somewhere up above Earthen Peak. I love that Dark Souls world is so meticulously crafted that it could all realistically work with one another, but personally, I don't mind the fact that for some reason you go up this tower and it leads you into a molting lava area. That's fine. To me, that's fine. I just don't think about
Czyli niekoniecznie, ale ja bym chciał zobaczyć tą windę właśnie.
it that hard, but I tell you this opinion so that you had plenty of time to see what exactly happens when you take the elevator from Earthen Peak over onto Iron Keep. There's a lot of evidence to show.
To jest tak głupie. Wychodzisz z open worlda, wchodzisz w windę i wchodzisz w drugi open world. I jest takie, skąd to się ty chyba dzisiaj tam dojdziemy, nie? Ale skąd to się kurwa wzięło? Jak to się wydarzyło?
Do intersect with one another, which doesn't allow for it to geographically coexist. And now let's take a look at Drangleic Castle. It's a very imposing structure, and so naturally, it's incredibly fun to take the camera all the way up here and show you the top of the castle and take a look at it from different angles. But even better than that, we got the Shrine of Amana, and there's so many vines here. But what's really cool is that if you take the camera up, you can see that most of the vines that you're looking at are in fact a sky dome, or at least a half sky dome. And then we're gonna do one more zoom out here of this very complicated area. And while you take a look at it, if you're like, hey, this He Says guy's pretty all right, I wouldn't mind helping him out a little bit. Seriously, the best way you can help out is by clicking on this playlist that has all the other From Software episodes I've ever done. Bloodborne, Elden Ring, Dark Souls. I can promise you that watching one more video at least will go a long way in helping this channel out. But if lunch break's over and you can't, it's totally fine. Take care and I hope to see you again.
Bloodborne'a obejrzymy kiedy indziej, jak będziemy Bloodborne'a ogrywać, nie? Zazwyczaj jak jakąś grę ogrywamy, to wtedy oglądamy sobie od niego filmik. Ja mam je wszystkie gdzieś tam w moich filmach do obejrzenia. Ciekawe. To ta końcówka
And take a look at
z tym Iron Keepem, to mnie najbardziej zastanawiało, czy pokażę to, czy tego nie pokażę, bo to nie ma sensu. Całkowicie.